My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I built my life from the ground up right here in Chicago. Until last Tuesday, I thought the worst pain a man could endure was burying his wife. I was wrong. I went to the garage to check on my late wife's pride and joy, a pristine 1967 Ford Mustang Shelby GT 500. It was her life's work. Instead, I found an empty space and a fresh oil drip on the concrete. I called my 38-year-old son, Preston. Over the sound of airport terminal announcements, he casually told me he sold it. "Mom is gone, Dad," he said. "Why are you hoarding a piece of scrap metal? Monica has been severely depressed lately. She needed a trip to Paris to clear her head. Get over it." Mom. I was devastated until my phone rang an hour later. It was Victor Rollins, a local classic car dealer. "Harrison," he said, his voice urgent, "your son just dumped the Shelby here for a quick cash wire. You need to come down. Diana left something hidden inside the door panel. You need to see this. If you have ever felt betrayed by your own flesh and blood, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of my stories. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It means a lot to know who is listening." It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months since I buried my wife, Diana. 42 years of marriage gone in the blink of an eye to a sudden heart attack. The house felt immense and silent without her. She was the fire in my life, the spark that helped me build Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics from a single rented delivery truck into a 400-fleet empire stretching across the Midwest. But her real passion, her absolute obsession, was out in the garage of our Oak Brook home, a 1967 Ford Mustang Shelby GT 500, night mist blue with white racing stripes. For 25 years, that car was her sanctuary. She sourced original parts from across the globe, meticulously restoring every inch of it with her own hands. That car wasn't just metal and rubber. It was a piece of her soul. Since she passed, I'd go out to the garage every morning just to smell the oil and leather, just to feel close to her. That Tuesday, I opened the heavy wooden door leading to the garage, a cup of black coffee in my hand. I stopped dead in my tracks. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the concrete. Hot liquid splashed against my boots, but I barely felt it. The garage was empty. The space where the Shelby had sat just the night before was violently vacant. The only evidence it had ever been there was a fresh, dark drip of oil near the center of the bay. I felt a cold panic seize my chest. I rushed to the side door. Locked. I checked the main garage door mechanism. Intact. There were no broken windows, no signs of a break-in, no alarm triggers. The security system hadn't recorded a single breach. Someone had used the master key. Someone who knew the codes. Someone who knew exactly how to bypass the sensors. My mind raced. Only 2 people besides me had the access codes and the physical keys to that garage. My estate manager, who was currently on vacation in Florida, and my son, Preston. Preston is 38 years old. He lives in a modern glass-heavy monstrosity of a house just 3 blocks away, a house I helped him put the down payment on. He has always had a taste for the finer things, a taste vastly accelerated when he married Monica 4 years ago. Monica, who never met a luxury brand she didn't feel entitled to. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed Preston's number. It rang 3 times before he answered. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" His voice was entirely too casual. But what struck me immediately was the background noise. The echoed announcements, the dull roar of a crowd, the distinctive chime of an intercom. He was at O'Hare International Airport. "Preston," I managed to say, my voice tight. "Where are you and where is your mother's car?" There was a brief pause on the line. Not a pause of guilt, but a pause of annoyance, as if I were bothering him with a trivial detail. "I'm at O'Hare, Dad," he said, sighing heavily. "Monica and I are heading to Europe for a few weeks." "I don't care about your vacation." I snapped, the anger finally breaking through the shock. "I asked you where the Shelby is." "Look, Dad, I didn't want to make a big deal out of this." He started adopting that condescending tone he always used when he thought he knew better than everyone else. I sold it. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had to lean against the workbench to keep from falling. You what? I sold it, he repeated louder this time, speaking over a boarding announcement. Mom is gone, Dad. She's been gone for 6 months. Why are you hoarding a piece of scrap metal in the garage? It's just gathering dust and making you miserable every time you look at it. That car, I hissed, was your mother's life's work. It wasn't yours to sell. You stole it, Preston. Stole it, he scoffed. Dad, don't be dramatic. I'm your only heir. It was going to be mine eventually anyway. I just expedited the process. Besides, I needed the liquidity. Liquidity for what? I demanded. Monica has been severely depressed lately, he explained, as if this justified everything. You know how hard Mom's passing was on her. I almost laughed bitterly at that. Monica hadn't shed a single genuine tear at Diana's funeral. She had complained about the caterer at the wake. She desperately needed a trip to Paris to clear her head. Preston continued smoothly. A real vacation. First-class 5-star hotels. She needs to recharge. I did it for my wife's mental health, Dad. You should understand that. You always put Mom first. I'm just doing the same for my wife. Get over it. It's just a car. Get over it. The audacity was breathtaking. He had violated my home, stolen his mother's legacy, and was now lecturing me on being a good husband. Listen, they're calling our boarding group, Preston said quickly. We'll be out of touch for a bit. We can talk about this when we get back. Just relax, Dad. Take up golf or something. The line went dead. I stood in the empty garage, the silence ringing in my ears. He actually believed his own lie. He expected me to accept that he had stolen a priceless classic car just to fund a luxury European vacation for his spoiled wife. He thought I was just a senile old widower who would eventually roll over and forgive him because he was my blood. But as the initial shock faded, a cold, hard logic began to take its place. The logic of a man who didn't build a massive logistics company by letting people walk all over him. I walked back into the house and sat at my desk. Something was fundamentally wrong with Preston's story. A lavish first-class trip to Paris, even staying at the absolute finest hotels, might cost $30,000. Maybe $40,000 if Monica went completely wild on the Rue Saint-Honoré. But I knew exactly what that Shelby was worth. Diana and I had it appraised for insurance purposes just a year ago. A fully restored, numbers-matching 1967 Shelby GT 500 in that condition was worth a minimum of $350,000 in today's market. Probably more to the right buyer. Where was the missing $310,000? Preston was arrogant, yes. He was entitled. But he wasn't stupid enough to sell a $350,000 asset for a tenth of its value just to buy plane tickets. He was hiding something. The Paris trip was a smokescreen, a plausible lie designed to make me angry about his entitlement rather than suspicious of his actual motives. My gut told me there was a much larger play in motion. I needed to act. I reached for my phone, intent on calling my attorney, Rachel Thorne, to immediately freeze his access to the family trust and begin the process of cutting him entirely out of my will. If he wanted to play games with his mother's legacy, I would make sure he never saw another dime of mine. My finger hovered over Rachel's contact name when the phone buzzed in my hand. An incoming call. The caller ID showed Victor Rollins. Victor was the owner of the largest and most prestigious classic car dealership in the Chicago area. He was an old associate of Diana's. They had spent years trading parts, arguing over restoration techniques, and talking shop. Victor was a rough man, an old-school gearhead, who didn't suffer fools, but he respected Diana more than anyone else in the business. I answered the call immediately. Victor, Harrison. His voice was hushed, tightly wound with an urgency I'd never heard from him before. I'm sorry to call you so early, but we have a major situation here. I know, I said flatly. My son stole the Shelby. I'm assuming he brought it to you. Yeah, he did. Victor replied, his tone grim. He drove it into my lot about 2 hours ago. Demanded a quick cash wire transfer. Said you were downsizing and he was handling the estate. The kid was sweating bullets, Harrison, rushing me like he had a gun to his head. Did you pay him? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. I initiated the wire to get him out of here, Victor said smoothly. But I put a 24-hour internal hold on the funds. I know how much Diana loved that machine. I knew she'd never let that arrogant prick sell it, let alone to fund some European joyride. I felt a surge of gratitude for the man's sharp instincts. Thank you, Victor. I'll have my lawyer issue a stolen asset dispute immediately. Harrison, wait. Victor interrupted, his voice dropping to a near whisper. That's not why I'm calling. Forget the wire transfer for a minute. What is it? When he dropped the car off, I had my guys do a standard intake inspection, Victor explained. Diana was always meticulous, but I noticed the passenger side interior door panel was slightly misaligned, just a fraction of an inch off. I frowned. Diana was a perfectionist. She would never have left a panel misaligned. I popped the panel off to reseat the clips. Victor continued, his voice heavy. Harrison, your son didn't just dump a car here. Diana left something hidden inside the door cavity. The air in my study seemed to grow very still. What did she leave? I don't know what it is entirely, Victor said carefully. But it's addressed to you. You need to get down to my warehouse right now, Harrison. You need to see this with your own eyes. I lowered the phone from my ear, staring at the darkened screen. The call had ended, but Preston's voice still echoed in the quiet of my study. Get over it. He had said those words to me. My own flesh and blood had violated the sanctity of my home, stolen the history his mother devoted her life to preserving, and brushed it off as if he had merely borrowed a lawnmower. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. He thought he had me figured out. He looked at me and saw a tired, grieving 70-year-old widower who would accept his disrespect to keep the peace. He wrongly assumed my absolute silence over the past 6 months was a sign of weakness, a symptom of a broken man waiting for the end. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I did not build Caldwell cold chain logistics by turning the other cheek. When I started with a rusted delivery truck, competitors tried to run me off the road. I crushed them. I built a fleet of 400 refrigerated trucks moving millions across the Midwest by seeing through lies and striking back twice as hard. My grief had made me quiet, but it had not made me blind. I stood in the center of my home office and began to do what I do best. I stood there and analyzed the numbers. Preston was arrogant, entitled, and entirely too reliant on the trust fund I had established for him, but he was not illiterate. He claimed he sold Diana's Shelby to fund a vacation for Monica. It was a plausible lie designed to make me angry about his entitlement, rather than suspicious of his actual motives. He desperately wanted me fuming over a luxury vacation, so I would not look any deeper into his current financial situation. My gut twisted with a sharp, familiar instinct. The same instinct that had saved my company from hostile takeovers and corrupt vendors decades ago. Preston was making a desperate move. He needed cash immediately. He was hiding a financial crisis or funding something sinister. I walked to my desk and picked up my phone. I scrolled to the contact name for Rachel Thorne, my ruthless corporate attorney. I was going to instruct her to freeze his access to the family trust, strip him of his remaining shares in my company, and prepare the paperwork to write him out of my will entirely. If my son wanted to play games with his mother's legacy, I was going to ensure he never touched another dime of mine for the rest of his life. I pressed my thumb over her name. Before the screen could register my touch, the phone vibrated violently in my palm. An incoming call replaced Rachel's contact card. The caller identification displayed the name Victor Rollins. I did not utter another word to Victor on the phone. I ended the call, placed the device in my jacket pocket, and walked out of my study. I bypassed the main house entirely and went straight out the front doors to my daily driver, parked in the circular driveway. I did not call the local authorities to report a theft. I did not call Preston back to scream at him or demand explanations. When you have spent 4 decades building a massive corporate logistics empire from absolutely nothing, you learn very quickly that you do not announce your counterattacks with blaring sirens and flashing lights. You move in absolute terrifying silence. The drive to Victor Rollins and his classic car warehouse took exactly 35 minutes, but my mind covered entire decades during that span. I thought about my son, a man who had grown so incredibly comfortable resting on the velvet cushions of the immense wealth I provided that he fundamentally mistook my paternal generosity for profound stupidity. And then I thought about Diana. Diana was not merely a wife who enjoyed restoring vintage American muscle cars in her spare time. She was the sharpest, most ruthlessly analytical woman I had ever known. While I was out securing cold chain supply contracts and managing heavy truck fleets across the Midwest, she was the one sitting in the corporate headquarters auditing the ledgers. She served as the chief financial officer of Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics for 30 solid years. She had a mind that operated like a steel trap and an intuition for human deception that bordered on the supernatural. She possessed an uncanny ability to spot an embezzler or a corporate fraud from a dozen miles away. If a woman with her brilliant calculating mind had taken the time to hide something deep inside the structural framework of her most prized worldly possession, it was absolutely not a sentimental keepsake or a fond farewell note. It was a weapon. It was an insurance policy. I pulled my truck up to the heavy security gates of Victor Rollins and his private storage facility. The building was an imposing, unmarked concrete structure situated on the industrial edge of the city, surrounded by heavy chain-link fencing and high-definition security cameras. The massive steel gate rolled open the moment my front bumper approached the sensor. Victor was already waiting for me just inside the cavernous main receiving bay. He stood silently next to the pristine 1967 Shelby GT 500. Under the harsh, bright fluorescent lights of the warehouse, the deep night mist blue paint seemed to absorb all the energy in the room. Victor did not offer a polite greeting. He did not extend his hand for a friendly shake. His face was grim and completely businesslike. He simply tilted his head and gestured toward the passenger side of the vehicle. I walked over to the car, my heavy boots echoing sharply against the polished concrete floor. The interior leather panel of the passenger door had been expertly detached and laid carefully on a soft microfiber cloth over a nearby rolling workbench. The inner mechanical workings of the door were fully exposed, revealing a complex array of window regulators, metal framing, and sound-dampening material. Right there, buried deep inside the dark steel cavity of the door, nestled securely behind a thick layer of acoustic soundproofing foam, was a rectangular void where something had been glued. Victor reached into the breast pocket of his work jacket and produced a heavy-duty fireproof Ziploc document bag. The edges of the bag were lined with industrial waterproof tape. He held it out, and I took it from his hands. The plastic material was thick, textured, and surprisingly heavy. I could see the contents clearly through the translucent exterior. There was a standard black USB flash drive and a neatly folded piece of heavy stock parchment paper. It was Diana's preferred writing stationery. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady while staring down hostile labor union negotiations and vicious corporate raiders, began to tremble uncontrollably. I picked up a small utility knife from Victor's workbench, carefully sliced through the reinforced waterproof tape, and pulled out the folded parchment. I recognized her elegant, sharp, cursive handwriting immediately. The date penned at the very top right corner of the page caught the breath in my throat. It was dated exactly 14 days before the massive coronary episode that suddenly took her from me. She had sat down and written this letter a mere 2 weeks before she died. I slowly unfolded the heavy paper. The black ink was dark, deliberate, and pressed firmly into the page. "Harrison," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means our son took the bait." I felt a freezing chill radiate from the base of my spine, spreading outward to my fingertips. I forced my eyes to continue reading the steady, meticulous cursive. "You always wanted to believe the best about Preston. You always wanted to believe that his towering arrogance was just a temporary phase, that Monica's endless greed was just youthful ignorance that she would eventually outgrow. But I have spent my entire professional life tracking liabilities, and our son is the greatest liability this family has ever produced. I intentionally left a pre-signed blank title to this car, hidden securely in the bottom of the glove box. I knew that the exact moment I was out of the picture, Preston would start desperately looking for liquid assets to feed Monica's insatiable appetite for luxury. I wanted to test his fundamental greed. I wanted to see if he would respect my legacy and preserve the things I loved, or if he would sell me out for quick, untraceable cash. If this letter is in your hands right now, you have your definitive answer. I stopped reading for a moment, my chest heaving. My wife had orchestrated a posthumous loyalty test from beyond the grave, and the son I had raised, the boy I had funded and protected, had failed it in the most spectacular and offensive way imaginable. He did not hesitate. He did not mourn. He simply saw his mother's death as an opportunity to cash in a blank check. The letter did not end there. I swallowed the hard lump in my throat and moved my eyes to the final paragraph on the page. But this is not just about a stolen car, Harrison. Preston is not simply acting like a spoiled, entitled child throwing a tantrum. He is actively funding a betrayal that will systematically destroy everything we spent our lives building together. The black USB drive inside this bag contains everything I have been secretly investigating for the last 6 consecutive months. I did not want to bring this to you until I had irrefutable proof, but my health has been failing and I fear I may run out of time. Plug it into a secure computer. Look at the data I have compiled. Look at the banking routes. Do not let your fatherly heart blind you to the cold, hard math. Burn the rot out of our house, Harrison. Do what absolutely must be done. I slowly folded the heavy parchment paper back along its original creases and slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket. I reached back into the fireproof bag and pulled out the small black flash drive. It rested weightless in the palm of my hand, yet it felt heavier than a block of solid lead. Diana had spent her final months on Earth, protecting me, hunting down a threat I had been completely blind to. She had used her brilliant analytical mind to uncover a conspiracy happening right under my nose, orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. I looked up at Victor. His expression remained entirely stoic, but I could see the quiet understanding in his eyes. He knew Diana well enough to know that whatever was on that drive was going to cause an earthquake. Victor, I said, my voice eerily calm, stripped of all the shock and grief that had consumed me just an hour prior. I need to use the secure computer in your back office immediately. Victor nodded once, turned on his heel, and gestured for me to follow him down the long, dimly lit corridor of the warehouse. I gripped the flash drive so tightly, the plastic casing dug sharply into my skin. Preston thought he was playing a clever game. He thought he had outsmarted a clueless old man. But he had fundamentally forgotten who his mother was, and he was about to painfully discover exactly who his father was. I followed Victor through the heavy steel doors and into his private back office. The room was sparsely decorated, smelling faintly of rich motor oil and stale, dark roast coffee. Victor bypassed his main desktop computer and pulled a heavy reinforced metallic laptop from a locked steel drawer. He set it squarely on the desk and opened the lid. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, pale blue glow across the darkened room. Victor nodded to the leather chair, silently offering me the seat. I sat down, my joints aching with a sudden, profound exhaustion. I took a deep, steadying breath and pushed the small black flash drive into the side port of the machine. A security prompt immediately flashed on the high-definition screen. Diana never left anything unprotected. During her 30 years as my chief financial officer, she had designed the complex encryption protocols that safeguarded our entire logistics network. I typed in the long alphanumeric sequence we had always used for top-tier corporate emergencies. The progress bar loaded, and a single master folder appeared on the blank desktop. It was simply titled with our son's name. I double-clicked the folder. Inside was a meticulously organized digital archive. Diana had spent 6 grueling months building a flawless, airtight financial case. There were dozens of subfolders labeled with offshore bank names, transfer dates, and corporate locations. I opened the very first folder, which was clearly marked as travel itineraries. Preston had boldly told me he needed the money to take Monica to Paris. He claimed she was suffering from severe depression and desperately needed a luxurious European escape. I opened the first document in the queue. It was a receipt for 2 first-class round-trip tickets to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, along with a booking confirmation for a 2-week stay at an exclusive boutique hotel near the Louvre Museum. For a fraction of a second, a wave of terrible confusion washed over me. Had he actually been telling the truth? Then I opened the very next document in the sequence. It was a formal cancellation confirmation. The Paris flights and the luxury hotel reservations were fully refundable. They had been booked on a Tuesday morning and completely canceled 48 hours later. The entire European vacation was a phantom. It was a calculated, incredibly cheap decoy designed to give me a highly emotional, frustrating excuse for his sudden, desperate need for fast cash. He knew I would be furious about him wasting money on a frivolous trip, but he also knew I would eventually dismiss it as typical spoiled behavior. It was the absolute perfect smokescreen to hide his real movements. I clicked into the next file, which contained the actual unmodified travel manifest. Preston and Monica were not flying to France. They had booked 2 seats on a private charter flight, departing out of a smaller regional Illinois airfield. Their final destination was Georgetown, the capital city of the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands are not exactly known for their holistic mental health retreats. They are, however, globally recognized as one of the premier tax havens and offshore corporate banking capitals of the world. A cold, incredibly heavy realization began to settle deep in my stomach. The missing $310,000 from the Shelby sale was not meant for shopping sprees or fine dining. My son was moving raw capital offshore. I backed out of the travel folder and opened the next major directory, which was labeled Corporate Acquisitions. The screen instantly filled with hundreds of pages of scanned legal documents, offshore banking requirements, and intercepted corporate email chains. I leaned much closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Diana had meticulously tracked a series of digital communications between Preston and an offshore holding firm based heavily in Georgetown. The firm specialized in anonymous, highly aggressive corporate buyouts. Preston was using them as a legal shield to establish a completely untraceable shell company. I scrolled down to find the specific target of the acquisition. The name printed in bold black letters made my heart completely stop beating. The target was Vanguard Refrigerated Transport. Vanguard was my single largest and most vicious competitor in the entire Midwest. For the past decade, Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics and Vanguard had fought bitterly over every major supply chain contract in the region. We controlled the massive grocery supermarket chains. They controlled the highly lucrative pharmaceutical distribution routes. We were currently in the absolute middle of a massive multi-million-dollar bidding war for a regional agricultural contract that would secure our operational dominance for the next 20 years. I continued reading the files, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with horrifying clarity. Preston was not just a greedy son looking for a quick, unearned payout. He was orchestrating a hostile offshore buyout of my biggest rival. But Vanguard was a severely struggling company. They needed a massive influx of capital to restructure their debts and stay competitive against my trucks. The offshore holding firm required a substantial, completely untraceable earnest money deposit to initiate the blind acquisition process and lock in the purchasing rights. I opened the final financial attachment in the folder. It was the formal escrow demand from the Cayman holding firm. The required initial cash deposit to trigger the Vanguard buyout was exactly $350,000. The exact market value of Diana's fully restored Shelby GT 500. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the cool glow of the laptop screen, illuminating the sudden, profound darkness of my new reality. The sheer scale of the betrayal was absolutely breathtaking. Preston was not just stealing a classic car. He was actively plotting to steal my entire life's work. As a trusted executive within my family business, Preston had unrestricted daily access to our most sensitive corporate data. He knew our exact operating profit margins. He knew the exact maintenance and fuel costs of our massive refrigerated fleets. He knew the specific pricing algorithms we used to bid on supply chain contracts. He knew every single operational weakness and strategic strength of Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics. His plan was brilliantly, sickeningly simple. He would use the cash stolen from his dead mother to anonymously purchase our struggling rival through a Caribbean shell company. Then, operating entirely from the shadows, he would use his insider knowledge of my company's pricing structures to systematically undercut every single one of my active corporate bids. He would bleed my empire completely dry, transferring all of my hard-earned regional contracts directly over to Vanguard. He would bankrupt his own father, watching me slowly lose the company I built from nothing, all while he secretly reaped the massive untaxed profits from offshore. And he needed the quick cash from the Shelby to serve as the immediate down payment, because his personal funds were completely tied up in his wife's lavish, uncompromising lifestyle. He had literally stolen his mother's legacy to finance the ultimate assassination of his father's empire. I looked over at Victor. He was leaning quietly against the doorframe, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching my face carefully. He did not ask a single question about what I had just found. He simply waited in the silence for me to process the absolute devastation. For a long time, I did not speak a word. I simply stared at the illuminated screen. The grief that had weighed me down for the past 6 months, the heavy, suffocating sorrow of losing Diana began to evaporate. It was burned away entirely by a rising, white-hot fury. Preston had looked me in the eye and told me to get over it. He had played on my grief. He had used Monica's supposed depression as a weapon against my sympathy. He had turned the memory of his mother into a stepping stone for his own corporate treason. He thought I was a tired, grieving old man who would simply sit in his empty garage and weep over a missing car. He thought my profound silence was a total surrender. I reached forward and safely ejected the flash drive. I pulled it from the port and closed the heavy laptop with a quiet, definitive snap. I slipped the drive securely into my jacket pocket, right next to Diana's final handwritten letter. My wife had spent her last days on Earth arming me for a brutal war I did not even know I was fighting. She had handed me the exact weapon I needed to defend the empire we had built together. Preston wanted a corporate war. He wanted to play the role of a ruthless offshore raider. He was about to learn that the man who built Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics did not get to the absolute top of the industry by showing mercy to thieves. I stood up from the desk, my posture perfectly straight, my mind entirely clear. The mourning husband was gone. The wartime chief executive had finally returned. I thanked Victor for his absolute discretion and walked out of the warehouse. The drive back was a blur, but my mind was operating with a terrifying focus. I went straight to my home office, locked the doors, and closed the blinds. I sat at my personal desktop, a machine isolated from the main servers, and plugged Diana's flash drive into the port. I needed to understand the corporate treason. I opened the master directory and bypassed the financial ledgers. There was a secondary folder labeled Internal Communications. I double-clicked it. Hundreds of forwarded email chains and scanned server logs populated the screen. Diana had mirrored a hidden network drive. I began reading the top email thread. It was a tactical breakdown of Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics supply routes and vulnerable client contracts. The sender address was not Preston. The sender used a scrambled email service, but the author's voice, the specific corporate phrasing, and the precise logistical terminology were entirely too familiar. I scrolled down to the bottom of the chain where Diana had attached an IP address trace. She had tracked the anonymous email account directly to a specific terminal inside my own corporate headquarters. Terminal 4. My breath hitched in my throat. That terminal belonged to Bradley. Bradley was my vice president of operations. I personally hired him 6 years ago, plucking him from a failing firm, because I saw a hungry, driven executive who reminded me of my younger self. I mentored him, paid him an exorbitant salary, and trusted him with the keys to my empire. And here he was actively engineering the destruction of my life's work. As I read through the emails between Bradley and the offshore holding company, the true architecture of the hostile takeover became sickeningly clear. Preston was not the mastermind. My son, despite his expensive business degree and his towering arrogance, simply did not possess the intellectual capacity to orchestrate a shadow acquisition of a major competitor. Preston was nothing more than a useful idiot. He was the necessary bloodline connection required to access the massive amounts of untraceable capital needed to fund the initial escrow deposit. Bradley was feeding Preston the narrative that they were going to team up, buy Vanguard in secret, and rule the logistics market together. Bradley provided the blueprints, and Preston provided the stolen cash. But the deeper I dug into the communication files, the darker the conspiracy became. There was a third folder separated from the corporate data. Diana had simply labeled it with Monica's name. I clicked on the folder. My stomach turned to ice. The screen filled with photographs, hotel receipts, and hundreds of captured text messages. It was not corporate espionage. It was a digital diary of a 2-year-long, incredibly brazen affair. There were photos of Monica and Bradley sitting intimately at a high-end restaurant in Chicago, taken by a private investigator Diana must have hired. There were digital receipts for luxury hotel suites, booked under Bradley's name, coinciding perfectly with the weekends Preston was out of town. I opened the text message transcripts. Reading the conversations between my daughter-in-law and my vice president of operations made my skin crawl. They were not merely romantic messages. They were calculated, venomous exchanges dripping with contempt for my son. They laughed at his gullibility. They mocked his desperate need to impress Monica with luxury goods. They openly discussed how easy it was to manipulate his deep-seated insecurities and his overwhelming desire to finally step out of my shadow. Bradley was the one who planted the idea of the Vanguard buyout in Preston's head. Monica was the one who whispered in Preston's ear every single night, convincing him that I would never hand over the company, that I was a stubborn old man who would force him to wait decades for his rightful inheritance. She pushed him, prodded him, and manipulated his greed until he was entirely convinced that stealing from his own family was a brilliant, necessary business move. But the final, most devastating layer of the truth was detailed in a locked spreadsheet Bradley had shared exclusively with Monica. It was the post-acquisition financial model. Once the offshore shell company successfully purchased Vanguard, using the funds from the stolen Shelby, Bradley planned to systematically transfer all of Caldwell Cold Chain's premium client contracts over to the newly acquired company. He would bankrupt my empire. But the holding company was entirely structured to funnel the resulting profits into a private, untraceable account in the Cayman Islands, an account Preston had no legal access to. Bradley and Monica were planning to bleed my son dry. They were going to use his stolen money to buy the rival firm, use his insider access to destroy my company, and disappear, together with the offshore fortune. They planned to leave Preston standing in the ashes of a bankrupt empire facing inevitable federal investigations for corporate fraud and grand theft auto, completely alone and entirely to blame. My son was a fool. He was a greedy, arrogant, ungrateful fool who had stolen his mother's legacy to fund a luxury trip for a woman who despised him. But he was walking blindly into a slaughterhouse. He was so blinded by his own ego and his wife's toxic manipulations that he could not see the blade resting against his neck. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The weight of the betrayal was staggering. A wife plotting against her husband. An executive plotting against his mentor. A son betraying his father. All of it swirling around the missing $350,000. Diana had watched the vipers circling our family, spending her final months gathering the venom they left behind, storing it safely away so I could eventually formulate an antidote. I had every single piece of the puzzle. The offshore banking routes, the forged escrow, demands the undeniable proof of the affair and the exact coordinates of their treason. They believed the Paris decoy had worked, that I was fuming over a vacation, while they quietly executed their master plan in the Caribbean. I closed the folders one by one. I pulled the flash drive from the machine and held it in the palm of my hand. The anger within me had completely solidified. It was no longer a hot, chaotic rage. It was a cold, absolute certainty. Bradley wanted to play the role of the invisible corporate assassin. Monica wanted to play the role of the wealthy, untouchable widow running off with her lover. And Preston thought he could buy his wife's loyalty by selling out his family. I reached slowly for my heavy desk phone. The time for silent investigation was over. It was time to build a cage so incredibly tight that not a single one of them would ever find a way out. I was going to let them think their grand plan was working perfectly. I was going to let them walk right to the edge of their offshore victory. And then, with a single devastating movement, I was going to pull the earth right out from under their very feet. My hand hovered above the receiver of my desk phone, prepared to initiate the corporate lockdown, when the sudden chime of my cell phone broke the absolute silence of my study. I withdrew my hand and pulled out the smartphone. The screen displayed a new text message notification. The sender was Preston. Knowing the profound depths of his financial treason and his sickening complicity in his wife's affair, simply seeing his name on a screen filled me with a cold, hollow disgust. I swiped the screen to open the message. It was an image file followed by a short line of text. I tapped the image to download it, waiting for the file to render. The photograph filled my screen. It was a brightly lit selfie taken inside a private first-class airline suite. Preston and Monica were seated close together, glowing with the arrogant radiance of people who believed they had just pulled off the heist of the century. Preston was wearing a tailored blazer, holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne toward the camera in a mock toast. Beside him, Monica was leaning against his shoulder, flashing a pearly white smile she exclusively reserved for moments of profound deception. She was wearing oversized sunglasses pushed up onto her head and a delicate silk scarf draped around her neck. They looked like an affluent couple embarking on a romantic holiday. Beneath the photograph, Preston typed a caption that read, "Sorry about the car, Dad. We will make it up to you when we get back from France. Love you." I sat rigidly in my chair, reading those short sentences over and over. Sorry about the car. He had reduced the theft of a $350,000 heirloom, his mother's final masterpiece, to a casual inconvenience. We will make it up to you when we get back from France. Another layer of the smokescreen designed by Bradley and executed by my foolish son. And finally, that was the most offensive part. The casual deployment of a sacred family bond to pacify a man he was actively plotting to bankrupt and destroy. I stared at their smiling faces. They genuinely thought they had won. They sat in those seats drinking imported champagne paid for by the blood and sweat of my late wife, thoroughly convinced their intricate plan was flawlessly executing. Preston thought he was outmaneuvering his clueless father. Monica thought she was manipulating her husband into funding a permanent escape with her lover. They were celebrating a victory they had not yet earned, secure in the delusion that I was sitting at home nursing a grudge over a canceled vacation rather than dismantling their criminal enterprise. I brought my thumb to the screen and began to pinch and zoom, analyzing the photograph with the exact same meticulous scrutiny I applied to massive corporate merger contracts. I looked at the lighting. I looked at the curve of the airplane windows. I looked at the reflection in Monica's sunglasses. And then I saw it. The fatal flaw in their perfect visual lie. In the upper left corner of the photograph, slightly blurred but discernible in the background, behind Monica's styled hair, a flight attendant was moving down the narrow aisle of the cabin. The attendant was wearing a distinctive tropical uniform that belonged to an exclusive private charter airline I knew quite well. More importantly, the attendant was holding a silver service tray at shoulder height. Resting flat on top of the tray, angled perfectly toward the camera, was a glossy travel magazine. I zoomed in closer, pushing the image resolution to its absolute maximum limit. The bold text on the cover of the magazine leaped off the screen. It read, "Discover the Cayman Islands, your ultimate Caribbean escape." I let out a low, humorless laugh that echoed in the empty study. The sheer hubris of it all. They were so incredibly eager to gloat, so desperate to solidify their fake alibi with a triumphant photograph, that they had failed to check their surroundings. They had literally sent me photographic confirmation of their true flight path. The travel magazine was the final piece of physical evidence that verified everything Diana had uncovered on her flash drive. They were not flying across the Atlantic to Paris. They were heading straight south into the Caribbean banking haven to finalize the hostile Vanguard acquisition. I lowered the phone and placed it gently on the mahogany surface of my desk. The pieces of the board were now set. I knew exactly where they were going. I knew exactly what they intended to do once they landed. I knew the identities of every traitor involved in the corporate coup. Most men in my position would have reacted with immediate explosive rage. They would have called the police, dispatched lawyers to the airport, or bombarded the sun with furious phone calls demanding surrender. But I did not build my company by throwing temper tantrums. When you are preparing to annihilate an enemy who believes they are smarter than you, the worst thing you can do is alert them to the fact that you are holding a loaded weapon. If I confronted Preston now, he would panic. He would call Bradley, and they would immediately scramble to cover their digital tracks, hide the stolen funds, and deny everything. They would drag my company into a messy legal battle that could damage our regional reputation and spook our clients. No. I needed them to feel completely safe. I needed them to land in the Cayman Islands, walk into that offshore bank, and firmly commit themselves to the fraudulent transaction. I needed them to push all their stolen chips into the center of the table before I flipped it over. I picked my phone back up. I needed to send a response. It had to be the perfect reply. It could not be too angry, because Preston would suspect I was digging deeper. It could not be too forgiving, because that would seem highly uncharacteristic of a man whose prized vehicle had just been stolen. It needed to be the exact kind of dismissive, passive-aggressive response a tired, defeated father would send to a spoiled son. I opened the digital keyboard. I did not type a single word. I did not demand apologies or issue empty threats. Instead, I opened the emoji menu. I selected the simple yellow thumbs-up icon. A single thumbs up. A universal symbol of reluctant, dismissive acknowledgement. It was the digital equivalent of an exhausted sigh. It communicated exactly what Preston wanted to hear. That I was irritated, that I was done arguing for the day, and that I was completely oblivious to the massive corporate conspiracy unfolding behind the photograph. I pressed send. I watched the text bubble appear on the screen. In that quiet moment, the dynamic of our relationship fundamentally shifted. The father who had funded his son officially ceased to exist. I was no longer a parent. I was a chief executive officer neutralizing a critical threat. I placed the phone face down. The silent war had begun. I drafted unyielding protocols to dismantle their future. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Rachel Thorne. Rachel was the apex predator of the Chicago legal district. For 15 years, she served as primary counsel for Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics, defending my empire from hostile competitors and opportunistic lawsuits. She possessed a mind as sharp as a diamond blade. She never asked unnecessary questions or hesitated when given a direct command. The line rang exactly twice before she answered. Her voice was crisp, professional, and alert. "Harrison," she said smoothly, "I assume this is not a social call." I kept my voice devoid of emotion. The grief was gone, replaced by cold, calculated precision. "Rachel," I said flatly, "I need you to initiate a total operational lockdown tonight." I heard her shift in her chair. She immediately recognized the tonal shift. The mourning widower she had dealt with for 6 months had vanished. The wartime executive had returned. "Tell me exactly what you need, Harrison," she replied. I leaned back, staring at the darkened window. "First, I want you to freeze all of Preston and his wife's access to the family trust accounts. Every single one of them." She paused briefly. "That is a drastic maneuver, Harrison. If I freeze those trust accounts, their personal credit cards will decline instantly. Their automated mortgage payments will bounce. They will be locked out of their primary liquid assets before sunrise. I did not blink. That is precisely the objective, Rachel. Cut off their financial oxygen. Preston abused my generosity for the last time. I want them stranded with whatever loose cash they have in their pockets. Rachel typed rapidly on her keyboard. Consider the trust accounts locked, she confirmed. What is the next step? My voice dropped, settling into a grim cadence. Step 2 involves Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics directly. You are to immediately revoke all of Preston's corporate signatory powers. Strip his executive security clearances across the company network. Cancel his issued credit lines, revoke his access badges, and lock him out of the primary servers. He is no longer authorized to sign agreements, negotiate contracts, or access internal ledgers. I want him excommunicated from the operational infrastructure of my company. Rachel stopped typing. The silence on the line was thick with unspoken realization. Stripping an executive of signatory powers without a board meeting was an aggressive maneuver. Harrison, she said carefully, revoking his privileges so suddenly will send a massive shockwave through the entire Human Resources Department. It will raise immediate questions among the board of directors. Let them ask their questions, I replied sharply. I built this entire company from a single rusted delivery truck. I own the absolute majority of the voting shares. Preston has engaged in actions that severely threaten the foundational stability of Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics. I will personally address the board when the time is right. For now, you execute the revocation protocol without hesitation. Understood, Rachel said softly. Her voice carried the distinct tone of a woman witnessing the beginning of a brutal corporate execution. The executive revocations will take effect within the hour. Is there a third directive? I closed my eyes for a brief moment, picturing the night mist blue paint of Diana's stolen Shelby GT500 sitting silently in Victor Rollins' storage warehouse. Yes, I said. There is one final matter, and it requires your most delicate touch. Preston stole Diana's classic car this morning. He transported the vehicle to a private dealership and attempted to liquidate the asset for $350,000. He demanded a rapid wire transfer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I heard Rachel exhale a sharp, stunned breath. Harrison, that is Grand Theft Auto. I can have local law enforcement waiting for him at the airport the exact moment his plane touches down. We can have him arrested before he even reaches the baggage claim. No, I commanded firmly. Do not notify the local police. Do not file a standard police report. If we involve the local authorities, it becomes a messy public domestic dispute. Preston will simply hire an expensive defense attorney, drag the entire situation through the mud, and attempt to stall the legal process. I want a much cleaner, far more devastating approach. I leaned forward, resting my elbows heavily on the desk. Instead of calling the police, I want you to file a formal stolen asset dispute directly with the financial institution holding the title. Report the fraudulent wire transfer attempt through the federal banking channels. Victor Rollins has already placed a mandatory internal security hold on the pending funds. I want you to leverage that hold. Let the automated fraud systems of the international banking network do the heavy lifting for us. Rachel let out a low, appreciative hum. I see your strategy, she noted. If we report the unauthorized sale and the offshore wire attempt through federal banking fraud channels, we trigger an automatic international anti-money laundering protocol. The banks will independently freeze the offshore destination accounts. They will flag Preston and Monica as high-risk financial criminals. It elevates the crime from a simple local theft to an international banking crisis. Exactly. I confirmed, a cold satisfaction settling over my words. I do not want Preston sitting comfortably in a local jail cell, waiting for a bail hearing. I want him stranded in the Cayman Islands, completely locked out of his trust funds, stripped of his corporate identity, and permanently flagged by the international banking system. When he walks into that offshore bank tomorrow morning to check on his stolen money, I want him to face a wall of federal fraud alerts. I want him to experience the exact terrifying moment when he realizes he has absolutely nothing left. I will draft the fraud dispute immediately, Rachel assured me. Her tone was no longer cautious. It was energized, ready for the battle ahead. The asset freeze, the executive revocation, and the banking alerts will all be fully active before dawn. They will not see any of this coming. That is the entire point, Rachel. I kept my gaze fixed on the digital clock resting on the corner of my desk. They think they have outsmarted a grieving widower. They think they are flying toward a luxurious stolen future. Make sure the financial cage is completely locked before they even step off that airplane. I ended the phone call and placed the device down. The study was perfectly silent. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out over the sprawling grounds of my estate. The moon cast long, pale shadows across the manicured lawns. The wheels of justice I had just set into motion were entirely silent, utterly ruthless, and absolutely unstoppable. Preston and Monica had built their entire scheme on the assumption that I would blindly accept their lies to maintain the illusion of a happy family. They had mistaken my paternal patience for weakness. They had mistaken my grief for incompetence. They had vastly underestimated the man who built Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics. The storm was coming, and I was going to watch it wash them away. The following morning arrived with a pale gray light that washed over the massive facade of Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics headquarters. I drove into the private executive parking garage exactly at 7, maintaining my daily routine, as if my entire world had not just shifted. Walking through the polished lobby, I politely nodded to the 3 security guards. I kept my posture slightly stooped, allowing my shoulders to sag enough to project the image of a deeply tired, sorrowful old man. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor, stepping out into the hushed corridor of the executive suite. My assistant greeted me with a deeply sympathetic smile. I offered a weak, trembling nod in return, playing the part of the shattered widower to absolute perfection. I walked into my sprawling corner office, closed the heavy door, and sat down at my desk. I did not turn on the main overhead lights, leaving the room bathed in dark, dim shadows. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the intercom, instructing my assistant to send Bradley in immediately. I waited in the dark. Bradley did not take long. 5 minutes later, my vice president of operations stepped confidently into the room. Bradley was a tall man in his early 40s, sporting a tailored suit and an aggressively ambitious smile. He possessed the sleek charm of a corporate predator, the exact kind of man who would sleep with his boss's daughter-in-law and plot the destruction of his mentor without losing a second of sleep. He walked across the carpet and stopped in front of my desk, his face instantly twisting into a mask of deep concern. He looked at the unlit room and then down at me, shaking his head with a perfectly rehearsed display of false pity. "Harrison," he said softly, his voice dripping with synthetic empathy. "You look completely exhausted. You really should be at home resting. The company can run itself perfectly for a few days." I slowly raised my hands and rubbed my eyes, letting out a ragged sigh. I forced my voice to sound raspy and hollow. "I am tired, Bradley," I replied, staring blankly at my desk. "Losing Diana has taken a toll on me that I simply cannot calculate. The quiet in that house is absolutely deafening." Bradley nodded solemnly, placing his hands in his pockets. "I know, Harrison. We are worried about you. You need to take a step back and let us carry the heavy lifting. That is why you hired me." I slowly lifted my head and looked directly into the eyes of the man trying to bankrupt me. "That is exactly what I wanted to talk to you about," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have spent the night thinking about the future of Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics. I have spent decades fighting for every single contract, but the fight has completely drained me. I look at the logistical maps now and I feel empty. I need to step away, Bradley. I need to retreat to my estate and figure out how to live without my wife." I watched a sudden spark of raw greed flash behind Bradley's eyes before he quickly buried it under another layer of fake concern. "Harrison, you cannot just walk away," he countered smoothly. "This company is your entire legacy." I shook my head slowly, leaning back in my chair. "A legacy is meaningless if you are too broken to sustain it," I replied. I am simply transferring the immediate operational burden. Bradley, you have been my vice president of operations for 6 years. You know our supply routes. You know our fleet maintenance protocols, and you know our major corporate accounts. I need someone I can trust to take the helm while I step into the shadows. Bradley stood perfectly still, trying desperately to conceal the massive surging triumph he must have been feeling in his chest. He thought I was handing him the keys to the castle. He thought his toxic manipulation and secret corporate sabotage had somehow miraculously aligned with my sudden grief. Harrison. I would be absolutely honored to step up, he said, his voice trembling with genuine excitement, disguised as humble duty. Whatever you need me to handle, I will manage it flawlessly. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of formal corporate transfer documents I had prepared the previous night. I placed them squarely in the center of the desk and tapped the top page with my index finger. I am officially promoting you to the position of Acting Chief Executive Officer for the Midwestern Regional Division, I announced. But more importantly, I am granting you full, unrestricted legal authority over the Vanguard acquisition accounts. Bradley stared at the documents, his breath catching slightly. He had been secretly plotting to use Preston's stolen money to fund an offshore buyout of Vanguard, completely unaware that I knew every single detail of his treason. Now I was legally handing him the exact accounts he was trying to sabotage. I want you to oversee the entire Vanguard merger. I continued, my tone completely monotone. I am authorizing you to manage the earnest money deposits, coordinate the financial restructuring, and sign the finalized acquisition ledgers on behalf of this company. You will have total legal autonomy over the corporate merger accounts. I trust you to do what is best for the future of this logistics network. Bradley slowly reached out and picked up the stack of documents, his fingers gripping the heavy paper tightly. He was looking at the exact legal authorization he needed to quietly siphon our contracts into his offshore shell company. He genuinely believed he had just been handed a license to steal millions of dollars without any oversight whatsoever. The documents were a carefully constructed federal trap. By accepting legal autonomy over the Vanguard merger accounts, Bradley officially tied his name and signature to every single fraudulent transaction he was about to commit. I was building an airtight federal corporate fraud case against him, and he was eagerly signing his confession. Harrison, I will not let you down, Bradley promised, clutching the documents. I will handle Vanguard with utmost discretion. You have my word. I just offered a weak, tired smile. I know you will, Bradley. Just make sure the banking deposits are completed smoothly. Make the transition entirely seamless. Bradley nodded emphatically, turned, and practically floated out of my office. He closed the heavy oak door, leaving me alone in the dim shadows. The moment the door shut, my weak expression instantly vanished. My posture straightened, the cold clarity returning to my eyes. Bradley was rushing back to his terminal to finalize the hostile offshore buyout, entirely convinced he was a corporate genius. He was initiating the massive financial transfers using Preston's stolen money, entirely unaware that Rachel Thorne had already flagged those specific offshore accounts with international banking fraud alerts. I sat perfectly still in the quiet office, a dark satisfaction settling into my bones. Bradley wanted to steal my empire, but all he had really done was accept the rope I just handed him. The federal authorities were going to have a flawless, fully documented paper trail leading directly back to his office. The parasite was finally going to hang himself, and I was going to watch it happen without lifting a finger. 48 hours passed since Bradley walked out holding the federal corporate fraud snare I hand-delivered to him. During those 2 days, I maintained my carefully constructed facade of a broken, grieving widower. I sat in my darkened suite, sipping coffee, and watching the digital tracking software Rachel Thorne installed on our mainframe. I watched with profound satisfaction as Bradley frantically logged into the Vanguard accounts, attempting to initiate the offshore wire transfers. He worked late into the night pushing stolen capital through corporate channels, unaware that every keystroke was recorded. Time-stamped, and forwarded directly to the Financial Crimes Division. The trap had been set, the bait taken, and the jaws were closing around my enemies. I did not have to lift a finger. I simply sat at my desk, watched the digital logs multiply, and waited for the explosion to shatter their pristine delusions of victory. The explosion arrived precisely at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. I was sitting in the quiet comfort of my home study, staring out at the manicured lawns of my estate, when my personal cell phone began to vibrate across the heavy wooden desk. I glanced down at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed my son's name, accompanied by an international routing prefix. I let the phone ring 3 times, allowing the tension on the other end of the line to build to an agonizing peak. I took a deep, steadying breath, cleared the cold, calculating edge from my throat, and practiced my warmest, most oblivious fatherly tone. I picked up the device and pressed the answer button. "Preston," I said, my voice thick with feigned, gentle surprise. "I thought you and Monica were supposed to be completely unplugged on your romantic getaway. I am surprised you are calling your old man so early in the morning." Dad, Preston gasped. His voice was frantic, pitched high with a raw, undeniable panic. He was breathing heavily, the sound of his ragged inhalations clearly audible over the receiver. In the background, I could hear the faint ambient noises of a bustling luxury resort. I heard the gentle clinking of crystal glasses, the soft murmur of wealthy tourists, and the rhythmic, unmistakable sound of tropical steel drums drifting through a hotel lobby. "Dad, something is incredibly wrong. I am standing at the front concierge desk right now, and everything is completely locked. My corporate credit card just declined for the 3rd time. I tried to use my personal platinum card, and the system rejected it instantly. I logged into my mobile banking application, and my main trust accounts are showing a balance of absolutely 0. Every single account is frozen, Dad. The bank is refusing to authorize any transactions. I cannot even buy a cup of coffee." I listened to the sheer terror vibrating in my son's voice, feeling a deep, chilling wave of satisfaction wash over my chest. The financial guillotine Rachel Thorne had engineered had dropped perfectly. Preston was currently standing in the lavish lobby of a 5-star resort in the Cayman Islands, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, completely and utterly destitute. He was a corporate raider without a single penny to his name. I pushed the grim smile from my face and injected a heavy dose of grandfatherly concern into my response. "Oh, son," I said, clicking my tongue in exaggerated sympathy. "That sounds incredibly frustrating, but you really should not be panicking over a simple banking glitch. You know how overly aggressive those automated fraud prevention algorithms can be these days. It is just a standard security protocol kicking in." "A security protocol," Preston practically screamed into the phone. "Dad, they have locked everything. The concierge is looking at me like I am some kind of vagrant. They are threatening to call the local authorities if I do not provide a valid form of payment for the suite. You have to call the Wealth Management Division immediately. You have to tell them to lift the security hold on my accounts right now." I let out a long, slow sigh, perfectly mimicking the sound of an elderly man confused by modern technology. "Well, Preston, you really only have yourself to blame for this minor inconvenience," I said gently. "The bank's security system is designed to detect highly unusual, out-of-character spending patterns. You live in Chicago, and suddenly massive charges are attempting to process from an international location. Of course, the fraud department froze the accounts. They are just trying to protect your assets from foreign thieves, but I am the one spending the money." Preston pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am the account holder. Tell them I am traveling. Tell them I am on my vacation." I chuckled softly, a warm, completely oblivious sound. "I am sure they will understand once we explain it to them, son. I will simply call the customer service line and inform the fraud department that you are exactly where you said you would be. I will tell them you and Monica are safely enjoying your romantic trip in Paris, France. I will assure the bank that any charges originating from the European Union are entirely legitimate and authorized by you. The silence that instantly swallowed the other end of the phone line was absolutely magnificent. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a man realizing he had just stepped squarely onto a hidden landmine. Preston could not correct me. He could not scream that he was actually standing in a bank lobby in the Cayman Islands attempting to initiate a hostile corporate takeover. If he admitted his true geographic location, he would completely obliterate the Paris smokescreen he had so carefully constructed. He would instantly confess to lying about the vacation, the stolen car money, and the true purpose of his trip. He was entirely trapped within the walls of his own deceit. He had to accept the Paris narrative, or confess to the corporate treason. "Dad," he finally whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, dawning realization. "Please." I did not give him the opportunity to formulate another desperate lie. I kept my voice incredibly light and cheerful, delivering the final, crushing psychological blow with surgical precision. "Do not worry about a single thing, Preston," I said warmly. "The bank is always difficult to reach on a Thursday morning anyway. I am actually heading out the door right now for a long, quiet weekend fishing trip up at the northern lake. Cell phone reception is terrible up there, so I probably will not have any signal for a few days. I will call the bank for you first thing on Monday morning when I return to the office. Just relax, enjoy the beautiful French architecture, and eat some delicious croissants for me. Tell Monica I send my love." Before he could utter another sound, I pressed the red button and ended the call. I placed the phone gently down on my desk and leaned back in my chair. The game was over. I closed my eyes and smiled, savoring the absolute silence of the room. My trap was now perfectly set. They were stranded, exposed, and utterly alone. I remained seated at my mahogany desk for a long time after ending the call with my son. The silence in my study was absolute, a stark contrast to the frantic desperation that was currently unfolding thousands of miles away in a sunlit Caribbean lobby. I knew exactly what Preston was going to do next. When a man believes he is drowning, he grasps at the nearest floating debris, no matter how fragile. His corporate identity was erased. His personal wealth was frozen. The intricate web of deceit he had spun with Bradley and Monica was unraveling at an astonishing speed. In Preston's panicked mind, there was only one remaining lifeline. He needed the earnest money for the Vanguard acquisition. He needed the $350,000 he thought he had successfully extracted from his mother's legacy. He needed Victor Rollins. I did not have to wait long for confirmation. Exactly 14 minutes after I hung up the phone, it rang again. The caller identification displayed Victor's private garage line. I answered immediately. Harrison Victor said, his rough voice carrying a distinct edge of grim amusement. "You called it perfectly. The kid just phoned the shop. He was absolutely losing his mind." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool surface of my desk. "Walk me through it, Victor. Leave nothing out." Victor cleared his throat. He called my direct line, bypassing the receptionist entirely. He was shouting so loudly I had to hold the receiver away from my ear. He completely dropped that slick, arrogant businessman routine he tried to pull on me yesterday. He was begging. He demanded I manually override the 24-hour internal security hold on the wire transfer. He told me it was a matter of life and death, a critical business emergency that could not wait another minute. He practically ordered me to push the $350,000 through to his offshore account immediately. "And how exactly did you respond?" I asked, feeling a cold satisfaction blooming in my chest. "I gave him the exact dose of reality you requested," Victor replied smoothly. "I told him to lower his voice and listen to me very carefully. I informed him that I could not push the wire transfer through even if I wanted to, because the funds were no longer under my control." I let that hang in the air for a second, Victor continued, and I could hear the kid hyperventilating on the other end. Then I delivered the killing blow. I told Preston that early this morning the State of Illinois Department of Motor Vehicles officially flagged the title of the 1967 Ford Mustang Shelby GT 500 as a stolen asset. I told him that the legal executor of the estate had filed a formal dispute claiming the vehicle was unlawfully removed from a private residence and fraudulently presented for sale. I closed my eyes, picturing Preston standing in the middle of that lavish resort lobby, the tropical heat suddenly turning to ice in his veins. "What did he say to that?" I asked quietly. He tried to deny it. Of course, Victor scoffed. He started stammering, swearing it was a massive misunderstanding, claiming he had your full permission to liquidate the estate. He insisted that if I just gave him the money, he would sort out the paperwork with you later. But his voice was shaking Harrison. He knew the game was up. I cut him off before he could spin another pathetic lie. I told him it was far beyond a simple paperwork dispute now. I informed him that because he attempted to wire the proceeds of a stolen asset across international borders, the transaction had automatically triggered an alert with federal banking authorities. The $350,000 was completely impounded by the federal government under suspicion of international wire fraud and money laundering. I told him the local authorities had already been by my warehouse to physically impound the vehicle as state evidence. The strategy was absolute. Preston could not argue with a federal banking freeze. He could not charm his way out of a money laundering investigation. He had walked into a vault, and Victor spun the locking wheel. He went completely silent, Victor recounted. I thought the line had dropped, but I could hear him breathing. I could hear his wife in the background, her voice shrill and demanding, asking him why the hotel manager was walking toward them with security. He finally asked me what he was supposed to do. I told him that was between him and the federal prosecutors. Then I wished him luck with his Parisian vacation and hung up. I let out a slow, heavy breath. Thank you, Victor. You have done my family an incredible service. Caldwell Logistics will remember this. You do not owe me a thing, Harrison Victor replied firmly. Diana was a legend. Nobody steals her masterpiece and gets away with it. I am just glad I got to be the one to slam the door on him. Victor ended the call, leaving me alone once again in the quiet expanse of my study. I walked over to the large bay window. The Midwestern sun cast a bright, unforgiving light across my property. I pictured my son miles away, stranded on a tropical island. He and Monica were standing in a lobby they could no longer afford. Their corporate credit cards were useless. Their bank accounts were completely locked down by Rachel Thorne's maneuvers. They had no liquid cash, no way to pay for their suite, and absolutely no way to purchase a return flight home. In the Cayman Islands, defrauding a hotel is a serious offense. Management would not offer sympathy to Americans who suddenly could not pay their exorbitant bill. They would involve the island authorities immediately. Furthermore, the corporate coup was dead. The offshore holding firm required a massive deposit to initiate the hostile buyout of Vanguard. With those funds impounded by federal investigators, the acquisition would instantly collapse. The holding company would sever all ties with Preston to avoid federal scrutiny. Bradley, sitting in his office at my corporate headquarters, would soon realize that the offshore accounts were flagged and the money was never going to arrive. He would panic, attempting to erase his digital footprints, completely unaware that I had already promoted him into a position where his guilt was legally undeniable and fully documented. Monica's elaborate plan to bleed my son dry and escape with her lover had spectacularly imploded. She was now marooned on an island with a man she secretly despised, a man who was rapidly becoming the primary target of a massive federal fraud investigation. She had pushed Preston into stealing his mother's car to fund her ultimate betrayal, and in doing so she had locked herself in the exact same inescapable cage. They were entirely isolated, stripped of their power, their wealth, and their arrogant illusions. The financial empire they had sought to conquer had instead risen up and completely crushed them. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk. I had successfully defended the legacy Diana and I had sacrificed everything to build. The silent war was over, and the victory was absolute. The silent war was over, and the victory was absolute. But a victory engineered in the shadows eventually demands a confrontation in the light. For 48 hours, I sat in the quiet comfort of my study, drinking dark roast coffee and watching the digital tracking software monitor their spectacular collapse. The Cayman Islands are an extraordinarily beautiful place to visit when you have the financial backing of a massive corporate empire. They are an unforgiving, hostile betrayals, and your accounts are frozen, your credit cards are declined, and you are actively flagged by the federal banking system for international wire fraud. I knew exactly what they were forced to endure. They were evicted from their luxury oceanfront suite. They were unable to access the funds they had stolen from Diana's beloved Shelby. They were entirely stranded, stripped of their power and their arrogant delusions. In the end, Preston had to swallow his towering ego and place a humiliating, desperate phone call to Monica's distant relatives. He had to beg for a rescue. Those relatives who had always viewed Preston as a limitless fountain of cash were forced to purchase 2 emergency tickets on a heavily discounted budget airline just to get them back to Chicago. It was a humiliating, agonizing journey home, sitting in cramped middle seats, surrounded by the very people they had always considered beneath them. I was sitting in my leather reading chair, quietly reviewing the final logistics reports for the upcoming quarter, when the heavy oak front doors of my estate suddenly burst open. The loud, violent sound echoed down the long hallway, followed immediately by the rapid, furious clicking of high heels against the polished hardwood floor. I did not stand up. I did not move. I simply closed my leather-bound folder, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for the storm to reach my study. Preston and Monica stormed into the room like a pair of rabid animals. The visual contrast between the glowing, triumphant couple in the airplane selfie and the 2 exhausted, haggard individuals standing before me was absolutely staggering. Preston was wearing the exact same tailored blazer from the photograph, but it was now deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat. His hair was disheveled and his face was flushed bright red with an uncontrollable, frantic rage. Monica looked entirely unhinged. Her delicate silk scarf was gone, replaced by a tense, rigid posture. The oversized designer sunglasses were pushed up onto her messy hair, and her eyes were wide with a fierce, calculating anger. They had crossed an ocean expecting to return as conquering corporate raiders. Instead, they had crawled back as bankrupt fugitives entirely dependent on the charity of distant relatives. Preston slammed his hands down on the surface of my mahogany desk, leaning forward until his face was inches from mine. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he screamed, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fury. "Do you have any comprehension of the absolute nightmare we just survived? We were thrown out of our hotel, Dad. We were treated like common criminals by the resort management. My cards were completely useless. The bank treated me like a suspect, and you did absolutely nothing to fix it. You promised me you would call the fraud department on Monday morning, but the customer service representatives told me no one from your office ever authorized a security release. We had to beg Monica's uncle to buy us budget airline tickets just to escape that island. You completely humiliated us." I looked at my son, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer an apology. I simply stared at him, letting the heavy, suffocating silence fill the room. This lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Monica even more. She stepped forward, pushing Preston slightly to the side, positioning herself directly in front of my desk. She was ready to deploy the ultimate weapon she had manufactured for this exact scenario. She was ready to play the victim. "This is entirely your fault, Harrison," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the wood-paneled walls. "We went to France because my mental health was completely deteriorating. I was suffering. I needed a peaceful, luxurious environment to heal, and Preston was simply trying to provide that for me. He sold that old car because he loves me, and he wanted to save his wife. But your absolute banking incompetence ruined everything. You were too busy playing the sad, lonely widower to make a simple phone call and authorize his accounts. Because of your senility, my healing retreat turned into a psychological trauma. I was publicly humiliated in a foreign country. We were treated like garbage because you could not handle a basic financial task. You owe me an apology, Harrison, and you owe us compensation for the emotional damage you have caused. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer breathtaking audacity of her words. She was screaming about a ruined trip to France, completely unaware that I had a high-resolution copy of the flight manifest proving they had landed in Georgetown. She was weaponizing her fabricated depression, demanding apologies and financial compensation from the man she was actively attempting to bankrupt. She stood there demanding respect while the digital transcripts of her venomous affair with Bradley sat securely on a flash drive in my top drawer. She played the role of the fragile, traumatized wife flawlessly. If I had not seen the absolute darkness in her text messages, if I had not read the calculated plans she made to bleed my son dry and disappear with her lover, I might have actually believed her performance. But I knew the truth. I knew she was a parasite. And I knew that Preston standing right beside her and nodding in furious agreement was a tragic, useful idiot who was too blind to see the poison in his own home. "Dad," Preston added, his voice dropping an octave, attempting to sound authoritative and commanding. "You are going to call the Wealth Management Division right now. You are going to demand they unlock my trust accounts immediately. Then you are going to wire $100,000 into my personal checking account to cover the damages, the embarrassment, and the sheer incompetence you displayed this week. We are not leaving this study until my financial access is fully restored. If you refuse, I will drag this family through a massive legal battle that will absolutely destroy whatever reputation you have left in this city. You are losing your mind, Dad, and I will not let your mental decline ruin my future." I looked at my son. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes, the sweat on his brow, and the desperate, greedy entitlement radiating from his posture. He was trying to bully me. He was trying to use the threat of public embarrassment to force my hand, entirely oblivious to the fact that his hand was already empty. I placed my hands flat on the desk, feeling completely resolute. The time for playing these foolish games was officially over. I was ready. Now, I pushed my chair back and stood up from the mahogany desk. I did not raise my voice, nor did I meet Preston's furious glare. Instead, I simply gestured toward the heavy double doors of the study. "If you wish to discuss financial compensation and the immediate restoration of your trust accounts," I said evenly, "we will not do it standing in the dark like arguing children. We will do it in the formal living room. Follow me." Preston offered a smug, victorious smirk to Monica, convinced that his aggressive ultimatum had successfully broken my resolve. Monica adjusted her posture, lifting her chin with haughty arrogance. They turned and marched out of the study. I followed a few paces behind them, maintaining a slow, measured cadence. They reached the threshold of the grand living room, stepping into the cavernous, unlit space. Before Preston could demand I turn on a lamp, a sudden blinding illumination flooded the room. The massive crystal chandelier suspended above the adjacent dining table snapped on, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the scene. Preston and Monica froze in their tracks. The room was not empty. Sitting around the long, polished expanse of the dining table was a carefully assembled tribunal of their absolute destruction. At the far end of the table sat Rachel Thorne, her posture impeccably straight, a thick leather briefcase resting open before her. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and a chilling, predatory expression. To her right sat Victor Rollins, his massive arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes locked onto Preston, with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Next to Victor sat a man they did not recognize. He was dressed in a sharp, unremarkable dark suit, projecting the quiet, dangerous authority of a federal agent. But it was the man sitting at the opposite end of the table that drained every single drop of color from Monica's face. Bradley. My traitorous vice president of operations was slumped in a high-backed chair, looking entirely defeated. He was sweating profusely, his tie loosened and his hands trembling violently as they rested on the polished wood. He did not look like a conquering corporate titan. He looked like a man who had just stared into the abyss and realized he was falling. Monica let out a soft, choked gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Her eyes darted wildly between me and Bradley, the devastating reality of the situation finally beginning to pierce her thick armor of delusion. Preston, however, was too blinded by his own towering ego to immediately grasp the severity of the ambush. He puffed out his chest, stepping squarely into the light, trying desperately to project dominance. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. "Is this some kind of sick joke, Dad? Why is Victor here? And Bradley, what are you doing sitting at my dining table when you are supposed to be managing the regional merger accounts?" Preston glared at me, his fists clenching at his sides. "I told you I wanted my funds unlocked, not a dramatic family intervention. I am not playing these games with you anymore." I walked past them, my footsteps completely silent against the Persian rug, and took my place at the head of the table. I did not yell. I did not match his frantic energy. I simply raised my right hand and pointed directly to a heavy wooden chair positioned opposite my own. "Sit down, Preston," I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of a judge issuing a final verdict. "You are about to find out exactly how much a trip to Paris really costs." Preston hesitated, glancing nervously at the federal agent, but the sheer gravity in the room forced him to comply. He slowly pulled out the chair and sat down, his previous bravado evaporating into thin air. Monica remained standing for a moment, her entire body shaking, before she collapsed into the seat beside him. "Allow me to introduce our guests." I began, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "You already know Rachel, my primary corporate counsel, and you clearly remember Victor. The gentleman sitting to your left is Special Agent Miller from the Federal Bureau of Investigation operating within the Financial Crimes Division." I paused, letting the word federal hang heavily in the silent room. "Agent Miller has been taking a very keen interest in the sudden, highly irregular movement of international funds involving the Vanguard acquisition." Preston swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Bradley. "What does Vanguard have to do with this?" he stammered. "I just want my trust funds unlocked." I turned my gaze toward my former vice president. "Bradley," I said softly, "why do you not explain to my son exactly what happened to the Vanguard acquisition?" Bradley flinched, refusing to make eye contact with anyone at the table. His voice was a pathetic, broken whisper. "The acquisition is dead, Preston. It is entirely gone." "What are you talking about?" Preston snapped, leaning forward. "You were supposed to finalize the earnest money deposit on Thursday. We had the offshore shell company established. We had the capital ready to wire." "You had stolen capital?" Rachel Thorne corrected him, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "Capital obtained from the fraudulent sale of a classic automobile that did not belong to you. Funds that were immediately flagged by the state, impounded by the federal banking authorities, and permanently frozen before they could ever reach your phantom holding company." Preston looked wildly at Victor. "You told me the transfer was just delayed," he accused. "You told me it was a security hold." "I told you the federal government impounded the funds," Victor replied coldly. "And I told you the local police impounded the vehicle. You tried to sell a stolen asset across international borders to fund a corporate coup. You really thought you were smarter than everyone else in the room." I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. "You see, Preston, you and Bradley thought you had engineered a flawless corporate sabotage. You believed you could siphon millions of dollars from Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics, push the capital through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, and leave me holding a bankrupt shell. And you, Monica," I shifted my focus to my daughter-in-law, watching her shrink back into her chair. "You thought you could manipulate my son into funding your permanent escape. You thought your affair with Bradley was a brilliantly kept secret. You thought you could mock my grief, drain my accounts, and simply fly away to a tropical paradise." Monica began to violently sob, her small frame convulsing in absolute terror. "Your father is entirely correct, Mr. Caldwell," Special Agent Miller stated in a calm voice, sliding a thick stack of printed transcripts across the polished wood. "We have fully documented evidence of wire fraud, grand theft, auto conspiracy, to commit corporate espionage, and international money laundering. Your entire future and freedom now belong to the federal government. Now you will sit quietly, and you will listen to Special Agent Miller explain exactly how you are going to surrender. The heavy silence that followed my final command was absolutely suffocating. Preston sat entirely paralyzed in his chair, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths as he stared at the thick stack of federal transcripts resting on the table. The severe reality of his impending arrest was finally piercing the thick armor of his arrogance. But Monica was not ready to surrender. She possessed the desperate, reckless instinct of a cornered predator. She suddenly buried her face in her hands, forcing a series of loud, theatrical sobs that echoed violently across the expansive dining room. She shook her head back and forth, her tears dripping onto the polished mahogany surface as she attempted to resurrect the very lie that had just been utterly dismantled. "This is a massive misunderstanding," Monica wailed, looking frantically between Special Agent Miller and me. We were in Paris. We were walking along the river trying to save my mental health. I was having a severe psychological breakdown, Harrison. You have to believe me. Preston simply wanted to take his wife on a healing retreat to Europe, and you are trying to twist a beautiful gesture into a federal crime. We never went to any island. We never committed any wire fraud. You are listening to the wrong people. Your banking errors ruined my fragile state of mind, and now you are letting these government agents terrorize your own family over a simple vacation. I did not interrupt her performance. I let her cry, allowing her high-pitched voice to fill the room, until her fake sobs began to sound pathetic and hollow. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I slowly reached into the leather folder resting beside my right hand. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper and slid it across the long table. It glided over the smooth wood and stopped directly in front of her folded hands. Monica stared down at the document, her forced tears instantly stopping, as a wave of undeniable dread washed over her. "And that is a certified copy of the private charter flight manifest," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "It clearly shows your names, your passport numbers, and the exact trajectory of your private jet. You did not fly across the Atlantic Ocean to heal your fragile mental state in France. You flew directly south, landing at the international airport in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. You were sitting in a first-class cabin drinking expensive champagne and reviewing travel magazines featuring Caribbean resorts. Your meticulously planned Parisian alibi is a complete fabrication, Monica. The federal government knows exactly where you went, exactly what time you landed, and exactly which luxury resort evicted you this morning." Preston looked down at the flight manifest, his face turning an ashen, sickly shade of gray. "Dad," he whispered weakly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the room. "We can explain the destination change. It was a last-minute decision. We just wanted some sunshine." I ignored his pathetic excuse. I reached back into the leather folder and withdrew a much thicker stack of legal documents. These papers bore the official seals of the Cayman Islands Financial Registry. I slid this second stack across the table, watching it come to a rest next to the flight manifest. "Those are the incorporation papers for a Caribbean shell company," I explained, keeping my gaze locked onto my son. "A phantom holding firm designed specifically to funnel millions of dollars through unregulated offshore channels. And if you look very closely at the bottom of the last 3 pages, Preston, you will see your own signature authorizing the creation of that entity. You will also see the authorization for a massive earnest money deposit intended to initiate a hostile corporate takeover of Vanguard Logistics." Preston stared at the signatures, his eyes widening in absolute horror. He vigorously shook his head, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the paper. "I did not sign these," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. "I swear to you, Dad, I have never seen these specific documents in my entire life. That is not my handwriting. Someone forged my name." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the edge of the table. "I know you did not sign them, Preston," I replied coldly. "You do not possess the intellectual capacity to orchestrate a complex international corporate merger. You were simply the required financial vehicle. You stole the legacy of your dead mother to buy a Caribbean shell company and steal my life work. But you are too stupid to realize you were just the piggy bank. Preston blinked, his mind struggling to process the insult and the revelation simultaneously. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, looking desperately around the table. "If I did not sign the corporate papers, who did?" I slowly shifted my gaze down the length of the table, letting my eyes settle on the broken, sweating figure of my vice president. Bradley had not moved a single muscle since the lights turned on. He sat in quiet agony, staring down at his lap, thoroughly defeated. "Tell him, Bradley," I commanded softly. "Tell my son how you forged his signature on the offshore incorporation documents. Tell him how you used the $350,000 he stole from his mother to fund your own hostile takeover. Tell him how you planned to bleed Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics dry, shift our primary accounts into your hidden Caribbean firm, and leave Preston holding the bag for federal corporate fraud." Preston turned his head, staring at Bradley with a look of utter betrayal. "Bradley," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Is that true? Did you set me up to take the fall for the Vanguard buyout?" Bradley slowly raised his head. He looked at Preston, then he looked at Monica before finally meeting my eyes. He nodded once, a slow, shameful admission of his absolute guilt. "I forged the documents," Bradley confessed, his voice dry and hollow. "I needed the earnest money to secure the offshore accounts, but I could not use my own name without triggering an internal audit. I needed a wealthy, gullible patsy. I needed someone with a high enough corporate clearance to bypass the initial security checks, but foolish enough to believe they were actually in charge." Preston looked like he had just been physically struck. He slumped back in his chair, the reality of his monumental failure crashing down upon his shoulders. He had betrayed his father, stolen from the estate of his mother, and risked his entire future, all to be manipulated by a man he thought was his partner. He was nothing but a pawn in a much darker game of corporate treason. But the humiliation was not yet complete. I turned my absolute attention back to Monica. She was now sitting rigidly in her chair. "You thought you could manipulate my son into funding your permanent escape," I stated. "You actively orchestrated the timeline to align perfectly with the sabotage." Preston stared at his wife with wide eyes. "Because Bradley is never just an accomplice, he is your lover." The words hung in the air, sharp and inescapable. Preston physically recoiled, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the woman sitting beside him. He shook his head in violent, jerky motions, letting out a breathless, broken laugh that sounded more like a wheeze. "That is insane," Preston stammered, his voice climbing an octave. "That is absolutely ridiculous. Monica loves me. She would never do something like that. You are just trying to turn me against her because you hate that I finally took control of my own life." Monica seized the momentary sliver of doubt, leaning heavily against Preston and gripping his forearm with white-knuckled intensity. She forced another stream of theatrical tears, burying her face against his shoulder. "Do not listen to him, Preston," she wept, her voice muffled against his jacket. "He is trying to destroy our marriage to punish you. He is a sick, paranoid old man making up vile lies to manipulate you. Bradley and I only spoke about corporate matters because I was trying to help you succeed." I did not raise my voice to argue. "Arguing is what you do when your position is weak and your evidence is lacking." I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and slowly withdrew the small metallic flash drive. The very same drive my beautiful, brilliant Diana had taped to the underside of my desk drawer before she passed. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the harsh light of the crystal chandelier catch its silver casing. "My wife was a woman of extraordinary perception," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, resonant authority that commanded absolute silence. "Diana saw through your cheap synthetic charm the very first day Preston brought you to our home, Monica. She knew you were a parasite searching for a host, but she also knew that a mother simply telling her son that his wife is a toxic manipulator is a battle a mother rarely wins. She knew Preston would blindly defend you. So she decided to gather the necessary ammunition to protect this family. Even while her body was failing her, her mind remained as sharp as a razor. I turned away from the table and walked slowly toward the massive 80-inch flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the living room. The silence behind me was absolute. I could feel their eyes tracking my every movement. I reached behind the sleek display panel and inserted the flash drive into the primary digital port. I picked up the remote control resting on the polished credenza, turned to face the room, and pressed the input button. The large screen flickered to life, illuminating the dim corners of the room with a sudden, cold blue glow. I looked at Bradley, who was now weeping silently into his hands, completely shattered. I looked at Monica, whose fake tears had instantly vanished, replaced by a mask of raw, visceral terror. And finally, I looked at my son, who was staring at the blank screen with the terrified anticipation of a man standing on the tracks, listening to the roar of an approaching train. "Diana hired a private firm to install hidden surveillance inside your home 6 months ago," I stated flatly. "She placed a camera directly inside your own living room, Preston. She wanted to know exactly what was happening under your roof while you were busy playing the oblivious, aspiring corporate titan." I pressed the play button on the remote control. The screen immediately rendered a high-definition, wide-angle view of Preston and Monica's lavishly decorated living room. The digital timestamp glowing in the bottom right corner indicated a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 6 months prior. The room on the screen was quiet for a brief moment. Then the front door opened, and Monica walked into the frame, followed immediately by Bradley. Preston let out a soft, confused gasp as he watched his own living room on the screen. He watched his wife drop her designer handbag onto the sofa and turn to face the vice president of my company. There was no hesitation between them, no professional distance. Bradley immediately stepped forward, wrapping his arms around Monica's waist and pulling her into a deeply passionate, lingering kiss. It was not a brief lapse in judgment. It was the comfortable, routine intimacy of a long-standing, deeply entrenched affair. Preston stopped breathing. He sat frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the mahogany table so tightly, his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The man on the screen, his trusted corporate mentor, pulled away from the kiss and smiled down at Monica. "He actually bought the offshore expansion pitch," Bradley said on the recording, his voice echoing clearly through the surround sound speakers of my living room. "I cannot believe how unbelievably gullible your husband is. I told him he needed to establish an independent shell company in the Caymans to bypass Harrison's oversight, and he just nodded and asked for the paperwork." Monica laughed on the recording. It was a cruel, sharp sound that sliced through the heavy silence of my estate. "Preston is a desperate idiot," she replied, pouring 2 glasses of wine and handing one to Bradley. "He is so desperate to step out of his father's shadow that he will sign absolutely anything you put in front of him. He thinks he is a genius executing a masterstroke." Bradley took a sip of the wine and smirked. "It is perfectly aligned," he stated confidently. "I have the Vanguard acquisition funds staged. Once Preston funnels his portion of the capital into the holding firm, I will execute the digital transfer, wipe the ledger clean, and leave him holding the bag. The federal authorities will find his signature on every single document. By the time Harrison realizes his entire logistics empire has been gutted, you and I will be sitting on a private beach, and Preston will be looking at a 20-year federal prison sentence." Monica wrapped her arms around Bradley's neck, resting her head against his chest. "I cannot wait to be done with him," she whispered lovingly on the recording. "Just make sure the money clears before we disappear. I do not want to spend another miserable day pretending to care about this pathetic family." I pressed the pause button, freezing the image of Monica and Bradley in a loving embrace on the massive screen. The digital silence crashed back into the living room, heavier and more suffocating than before. I did not say a word. I simply looked at my son. Preston was completely destroyed. The physical transformation was immediate and absolute. The arrogant, demanding corporate raider who had stormed into my house demanding apologies and financial compensation was entirely gone. His chest was heaving with irregular, ragged breaths. A low, agonizing sound clawed its way out of his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak and fundamental betrayal. He looked at the paused image on the screen, then slowly turned his head to look at Monica. She was staring at her lap, refusing to meet his eyes, her face pale and devoid of any defense. The words hung in the air, a lethal strike that severed the last thread of my son's sanity. Preston stared at the frozen image on the screen. His eyes tracked the intimate posture of his wife resting against his corporate mentor. A deep, guttural sound tore its way out of his throat. He did not yell or demand an explanation. The betrayal was absolute, the humiliation profound. In a fraction of a second, the shock contorted into blinding rage. Preston lunged forward across the dining table. He moved with sudden, violent velocity, sending his chair crashing onto the polished floor. He threw his body weight over the mahogany surface, scattering the pristine stacks of federal transcripts. His hands clamped onto the lapels of Bradley's tailored suit. Before Bradley could defend himself, Preston yanked him forward and delivered a devastating blow directly to his face. The sound of bone colliding echoed with a sickening crack through the living room. Bradley let out a sharp cry of pain, his head snapping backward as he tumbled out of his chair and crashed onto the rug. Preston vaulted over the edge of the table, landing heavily on top of the vice president. His fists rained down in a flurry of blind, uncoordinated strikes. He screamed incoherently, his voice ragged and raw. Monica shrieked, scrambling away from the violence and pressing her back flat against the wall. She covered her face, terrified the rage would turn toward her. I simply watched the inevitable destruction of an alliance built on lies. The undercover federal operative moved with terrifying efficiency. He bypassed the table, reaching the chaotic scuffle on the floor in an instant. Miller did not issue verbal commands. He reached down, gripped the collar of Preston's blazer, and hauled him off Bradley with a single powerful motion. Preston flailed blindly, throwing a wild punch. Agent Miller effortlessly deflected the strike, stepped into his guard, and executed a flawless tactical sweep. Preston hit the floor hard, the breath rushing out of his lungs in a painful gasp. Miller pinned my son face down on the carpet, his knee firmly between Preston's shoulder blades, his right arm twisted sharply upward. "Stay exactly where you are," Miller commanded, his voice projecting absolute authority. "If you resist a federal officer again, I will add assaulting an agent to your charges. Breathe slowly and remain completely still." Preston stopped struggling. He lay pinned against the floor, tears of defeat streaming down his face and soaking into the rug. A few feet away, Bradley rolled onto his side, groaning miserably as he clutched his bleeding nose. His immaculate corporate veneer was entirely shattered, replaced by the pathetic reality of a broken thief. Victor Rollins stood up slowly, looking down at the two men with supreme disgust. He walked over and stood beside Miller, crossing his massive arms to ensure nobody attempted an escape. I turned my attention back to the table, adjusting my cuffs before nodding to my counsel. "Rachel," I said smoothly, "I believe it is time to formalize the consequences." Rachel Thorne stood up. She smoothed her suit, picked up a fresh document, and looked down at the pathetic scene. She spoke with an icy precision that offered absolutely no room for negotiation or mercy. "Bradley Davis and Monica Caldwell," Rachel began, her voice ringing clear in the quiet room. "You are both being taken into federal custody this evening. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has formally indicted you on multiple felony counts. These include international wire fraud conspiracy to commit corporate espionage and money laundering. We provided the prosecution with irrefutable digital evidence of unauthorized transfers, forged documents, and audio recordings explicitly detailing intent to defraud. You attempted to siphon millions from a federally regulated commercial entity. The holding company in the Cayman Islands has already been seized. Your personal bank accounts have been permanently frozen under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." Bradley let out a whimpering sob from the floor. He knew Rachel's words meant his life was officially over. Monica slid slowly down the wall, pulling her knees to her chest as she stared blankly at the ruined remnants of her fantasy. She traded her luxurious lifestyle for a federal cell, and the terrifying reality was finally crushing the breath out of her lungs. Rachel then shifted her cold, penetrating gaze down to my son, who was still pinned beneath the heavy, unyielding weight of Special Agent Miller on the Persian rug. Preston Caldwell, she continued, her sharp tone completely devoid of any lingering familial sympathy or forgiveness. While you were an unwitting pawn in their much larger corporate espionage scheme, your individual actions remain highly illegal and indefensible. The state of Illinois is officially charging you with grand theft auto and the fraudulent forgery of a legal vehicle title. Furthermore, the federal government is indicting you for conspiracy to commit international wire fraud stemming directly from your brazen attempt to transfer the illicit proceeds of that stolen vehicle into an unregulated offshore banking account. You willfully engaged in the intentional theft and liquidation of a highly valuable estate asset, and you will absolutely answer to those specific charges in a federal court of law. Special Agent Miller reached to his tactical belt and produced a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound echoed loudly through the room as he securely fastened Preston's trembling wrists behind his back. Miller hauled my son to his feet, pulling him upright. Preston could not even look at me. He hung his head, his shoulders shaking with silent, miserable, broken sobs. From the front hallway, the heavy front doors swung open again. 3 more federal agents stepped into the living room, their dark suits and grim expressions perfectly matching Miller. They moved swiftly across the room toward Bradley and Monica. Bradley offered absolutely no physical resistance. He simply held his hands out, his face covered in blood, as the agents locked the cuffs tightly around his wrists. Monica, however, began to scream. It was a shrill, genuine scream of absolute panic. She violently thrashed against the agents as they pulled her to her feet, kicking wildly and demanding they release her. It was a pathetic, futile struggle. The agents forcefully restrained her arms, clicking the steel bracelets securely into place. They marched her toward the door, her frantic shrieks echoing loudly through the grand corridors of my estate. Bradley was dragged out next, his head hanging low, in ultimate defeat, his shoes dragging against the hardwood floors. Finally, Agent Miller pushed Preston forward. My son paused for a brief fraction of a second at the threshold of the living room. He turned his head slightly, offering me a final shattered glance of desperate apology. I did not soften my expression. I did not offer a comforting nod. I stared back at him with the cold, unyielding resolve of a man who had successfully defended his empire from the very people he had tried to protect. Miller shoved him forward, and Preston disappeared into the dark hallway. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, sealing the silence back into the house. I turned to look at Victor Rollins and Rachel Thorne. The silent war was completely finished, and I remained the undisputed king of the battlefield. The silent war was completely finished, and I remained the undisputed king of the battlefield. But just before the heavy oak doors could completely seal him away into the dark hallway, Preston suddenly wrenched his body sideways. He threw his weight against the tactical grip of Special Agent Miller, catching the federal officer momentarily off guard. The sudden, desperate movement caused Preston to lose his balance, and he crashed heavily onto his knees. Instead of standing back up, he scrambled across the polished hardwood floor, dragging his handcuffed wrists awkwardly behind his back. He moved like a wounded, pathetic animal, his breathing ragged and frantic, until he reached the edge of the Persian rug where I stood. Before anyone could intercept him, Preston lunged forward and buried his face against my leg. He desperately clamped his arms around my knees, his tears soaking into the fabric of my tailored trousers. The grand living room, previously filled with the chaotic sounds of federal arrests, suddenly plunged back into a suffocating, heavy silence. Agent Miller immediately stepped forward to retrieve his prisoner, his face flushed with professional embarrassment, but I raised my right hand. I held my palm flat in the air, a silent, absolute command for the federal agent to wait. I wanted to hear exactly what my son had to say. Preston looked up at me, his face a bruised, swollen mask of absolute terror and devastation. His jaw was trembling, and a thin line of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, where he had bitten his lip during the struggle. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high, desperate whine. "You have to stop them. You have to tell them this is a mistake. I did not want any of this to happen. I was manipulated. Monica and Bradley, they used me. They twisted my mind and made me believe I was doing the right thing for the company. I never wanted to steal from you. I never wanted to hurt you or Mom. You know me, Dad. You raised me. I am your son. I am your blood. Please do not let them take me away to a federal prison. I will do anything you want. I will sign the trust accounts back over to you. I will divorce Monica tomorrow. Just make a phone call and tell them to drop the charges. Please, Dad, I am begging you. I am your blood." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken, weeping man clutching my legs. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal warmth. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to protect him, to shield him from the harsh consequences of the real world. The man sobbing at my feet was a complete stranger to me. I thought about the 38 years I had spent grooming him, educating him, and paving a golden road for his future. I thought about Diana and the endless reserves of love and patience she had poured into his upbringing. We had given him every conceivable advantage, every possible luxury, and every ounce of our devotion. And in return, he had treated his mother's death as a financial opportunity. He had treated my grief as a weakness to be exploited. He had sold out his own family for a fleeting taste of synthetic power and the approval of a venomous, manipulative wife. He was claiming he had been manipulated desperately, trying to shift the blame onto Bradley and Monica, completely refusing to accept accountability for his own greed. He was a coward right until the very bitter end. I did not offer him a hand. I did not offer him comfort. Instead, I slowly reached my right hand deep into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers closed around a cold, jagged piece of metal. I withdrew my hand and held the object up into the harsh, bright light of the crystal chandelier. It was a single silver key attached to a vintage leather fob bearing the classic emblem of a roaring Mustang. Preston stopped crying. His red, swollen eyes locked onto the dangling key, a look of profound, terrified confusion washing over his face. He recognized the key instantly. It belonged to the vintage Shelby GT500. It was the exact same key he had handed over to a fraudulent automotive broker just a few weeks prior. "You thought you could erase her memory to fund your pathetic corporate treason," I said, my voice dropping to a low glacial whisper that cut through the silence of the room. "You thought you could sell your mother's most prized possession, a vehicle that represented her vibrant, beautiful life, just to secure an offshore shell company. But you failed, Preston. You failed at business, you failed at marriage, and you failed at being a son. I tracked the fraudulent transaction the moment the funds hit your private account. I had my legal team contact the authorities, freeze the assets, and personally recover the vehicle from the impound lot, before the federal government even issued the grand jury indictments. Your mother's legacy is resting safely in my private garage. It is perfectly secure, exactly where it belongs." Preston let out a soft, choking gasp, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. He had absolutely nothing left to bargain with. His leverage was completely gone. "Dad," he whispered again, the words sounding hollow and meaningless in the vast space of the room. "I am sorry. I raised a son for 38 years, and I said, my words deliberately slow and perfectly articulated. I raised a boy who I believed possessed honor, integrity, and a deep respect for his family. But the man crying on my floor right now is not that boy. You are just a thief. You are a weak, greedy parasite who tried to bleed his own family dry." I stared directly into his terrified, unblinking eyes, ensuring that my next words would permanently shatter whatever lingering hope he still held in his heart. My son died of a heart attack the exact same day his mother did. You are absolutely nothing to me. I took a deliberate, forceful step backward. The sudden movement broke Preston's desperate grip on my trousers. His hands slipped away, falling uselessly against the Persian rug. Before he could attempt to crawl forward again, Special Agent Miller was upon him. The federal operative grabbed Preston by the back of his collar, hauling him forcefully to his feet. There was no more hesitation. Miller clamped a firm hand onto Preston's shoulder and marched him out of the living room, his heavy tactical boots echoing against the hardwood floor. Preston did not look back again. He hung his head entirely defeated and stepped out into the cold, dark night. The heavy oak front doors closed with a resounding, definitive thud. The lock engaged, and the estate was finally quiet. I stood perfectly alone in the vast space surrounded by the remnants of a completely shattered family. I slipped the silver key back into my pocket. I turned my back to the heavy doors and walked slowly into the deep, absolute silence. 6 months have passed since that dark night in my study. The gears of the justice system turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence, forged signatures, and audio recordings of his own treason, Preston realized he had no remaining leverage. His expensive defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal. My son, the aspiring corporate kingmaker, surrendered his tailored suits for a standard-issue uniform. He accepted a sentence of 5 years in a state correctional facility. During his sentencing hearing, he looked back at the gallery, searching the wooden benches for a familiar face, hoping for a final moment of parental sympathy. I did not attend. I had mourned the loss of my son a long time ago, choosing instead to focus on the living. The federal trials for Monica and Bradley were significantly more theatrical, lacking any shred of dignity or honor. The moment the federal prosecutors presented the offshore banking records and the surveillance footage from their own living room, their toxic alliance instantly shattered. They turned on each other like starved wolves in a cage. Monica wept before the federal judge, desperately claiming she was a victim of psychological manipulation, insisting Bradley had forced her into the conspiracy. Bradley retaliated by producing hundreds of text messages proving Monica was the primary architect of the financial drain, detailing her relentless greed and her explicit plans to abandon Preston. The judge was entirely unmoved by their pathetic, venomous display. They were both handed 10-year sentences in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and international money laundering. Their dream of a tropical paradise was permanently replaced by cold concrete and steel bars. With the parasites surgically removed from my life, I turned my absolute attention back to Caldwell cold chain logistics. The betrayal had exposed a deep systemic rot within the executive level of my own empire. I did not hesitate. I initiated a ruthless, comprehensive purge of the entire corporate board. Every vice president, director, and senior manager who had enabled Bradley or who had simply looked the other way was immediately terminated. I cleared the top floor completely. To fill the massive leadership void, I did not hire outside executives with fancy degrees and hollow promises. Instead, I went down to the shipping floors. I promoted the loyal, hardworking warehouse managers, the shift supervisors, and the logistics coordinators who had dedicated decades of their lives to the actual labor that built my company. They knew the business better than any boardroom politician ever could. The transition brought a renewed, fiercely loyal energy to the enterprise. As for the $350,000 Preston had stolen from the estate of Diana, the federal authorities successfully recovered every cent from the frozen Cayman accounts. When the check cleared my bank, I knew exactly what my wife would want me to do with it. I did not absorb the funds back into my corporate holdings. Instead, I established the Diana Caldwell Cardiovascular Research Foundation, dedicating the entire sum to funding medical grants for the study and prevention of sudden heart failure. Her name would not be associated with a cheap, fraudulent Caribbean shell company. Her name would be associated with saving lives, extending her beautiful legacy far beyond her tragically short time on this earth. This evening, the sky above Chicago is a brilliant canvas of bruised purple and vibrant orange. The setting sun casts long golden shadows across the pristine concrete floor of my private garage. I walk slowly past the rows of quiet machinery until I reach the far corner. The 1967 Shelby GT 500 sits perfectly still, its polished blue paint gleaming flawlessly in the fading light. I pull the silver key from my pocket, open the heavy driver's side door, and slide into the vintage leather seat. The cabin smells of old oil-rich leather and the faint lingering memory of Diana herself. I reach out, running my hand gently over the smooth wooden rim of the steering wheel. She had lovingly restored every single inch of this magnificent machine, with her own bare hands pouring her soul into the restoration project. I insert the key into the ignition and turn it. The massive V8 engine roars to life, a deep, powerful, mechanical thunder that warmly shakes the very foundation of the garage. It is a perfect machine, built by a truly perfect woman. I shift the heavy manual transmission confidently into gear, pull out of the driveway, and drive forward into the glowing horizon, knowing my beautiful wife is smiling down upon me finally and entirely at peace with my life and my protected legacy. I know she would be proud of the choices I made to defend her memory. Greed is a venom that blinds you to the hands that feed you. When you view family as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, you forfeit your right to their loyalty, their protection, and their love. True legacy is never built on what you can inherit or steal. It is built on integrity, hard work, and the respect you show to those who paved the way. Never mistake an old man's silence for ignorance, and never underestimate a parent's willingness to burn their own empire to the ground just to ensure the rats do not get the feast. Have you ever discovered a devastating secret that completely shattered your view of someone you loved? How did you handle the ultimate betrayal? Share your story in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for more relentless life stories.